He lifted the rifle to his shoulder and looked down the barrel at the wolf lying in his horse pasture. The animal was breathing in shallow pulls, a snare wire cutting into its back leg, the blood black along the snow. It had been chewing at the chicken house 3 nights running. He had every reason in the world to pull the trigger. He had lost 2 calves to wolves the year before, one of them to a wolf with a torn ear that fit the shape of this one's tracks. He set the rifle down in the snow. He walked toward the wolf with his hands open. That was the morning Abel Trenholm became the laughingstock of the Sulphur Creek Valley, and the morning that would later save every single head of cattle he still owned. The winter of 1879 had been the worst in living memory. The big die-up 2 winters back had already cut his herd from 80 head to barely 30. The pasture he had inherited from his father was good grass, but it sat on the only unfenced stretch of creek water for 10 miles in any direction. That made him a problem. That made him a target. And the man who had decided to make him a target had enough money and enough hired guns to make the decision stick. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. If you're listening from a kitchen, a porch, a quiet driveway, a nursing home room with the door pulled closed, tell us in the comments where you're with us. We love knowing who's on the other side of this story. Abel Trenholm was 46 years old when the wolf came into his pasture, and he had been a widower for the better part of 2 years. His wife, Mary, had died of the dust sickness that took so many in those years. He had held her hand in the long room at the back of the house until her fingers had gone cold enough to forget they had ever been warm. His daughter, Cora, had married a railroad man and moved east to Denver, writing letters that arrived less often than they should. His brother had gone to look for silver up in the mountains and never come down. Abel had the ranch, the horses, the cattle he was trying to keep alive, and a black mule called Reuben who hated everyone and was the only creature on the place who still liked him. That was the sum of him, as far as the valley was concerned. The wolf had watched him coming. Abel could see it in the way the ears flattened, not in fear, but in that tired resignation of an animal ready to die. He knelt beside it, the snow soaking through his trousers to the bone. He took his knife and cut the snare, working the wire away from the swollen leg as gently as he could. The wolf flinched once, then went still. It understood, in some old animal way, that this was not a man trying to kill it. Abel carried it to the barn, wrapped the leg in a strip of wool cut from an old blanket, and laid it down on a bed of hay beside the stove. He stood looking at it for a long time. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He had not been a soft man in his life. He had killed plenty. He had eaten what he had to eat and let the hunger be what it was. But something in the torn ear and the still gray eye of the wolf had reminded him of himself, the way a face in a Sunday crowd sometimes reminds a man of someone gone. He thought of his calves. He thought of his freezer. He thought of his pride. Then he poured a bowl of water, set it down beside the wolf, and walked out to milk the cows. By Tuesday, the story had reached every porch in Sulphur Creek. Mr. Garvey at the general store wiped the same spot on the counter 3 times when Abel came in for salt and shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he has decided someone is past saving. Mrs. Jensen, who had been a friend of his wife and was no longer, told the church ladies that Abel had finally lost what little was left of his mind. Even the Jensen's boy, who was barely 11, asked his father why Mr. Trenholm had brought a wolf home instead of shooting it like a sensible man would. The question hung in the air of the drugstore long enough for the men to stop pretending not to smile. The wolf stayed in the barn. Abel fed it rabbit and marrowbone broth. He changed the wrappings on the leg every morning before he did any other chore. He did not name it. He did not speak to it. He did not let himself think of what Cora would say if she could see the inside of his barn now. A sick wolf sleeping beside the hay he should have been saving for the weakliest of his calves. He just did it. He had learned by that point in his life that the things a man does when nobody approves are usually the truth of him. Everything else is performance. Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you when you stop looking for them, he said one morning to no one in particular, and forgot he had said it by the time he had walked to the well. Harlan Beck heard about the wolf the same week the rest of the valley did. Beck owned 3 ranches, the bank in town, and the only large-scale cattle operation in 10 counties. He had been trying to buy Abel's land for 9 years, and he had been trying to drive him off it for the last 4. His method was patience, the slow kind, the kind that comes with money. He had bought the water rights downstream, and let the wells on Abel's place go brackish just enough to weaken the stock. He had hired riders to push stray cattle toward the road in the night. He had, twice, arranged for the railroad to switch Abel's shipping dates so his cattle arrived at market too thin to fetch a fair price. He had never done anything he could be held to. That was the trick of it. The cruelty moved too slowly to be seen by anyone watching from one porch. What would you have done if you'd been Abel? A man offers you money for the only thing your father ever left you. The money is fair, more than fair. The man is connected, dangerous, and he doesn't lose. Would you have signed? Beck rode over on a Thursday morning with 2 of his men and a copy of a deed transfer he had already filled out for Abel's signature. He sat at Abel's kitchen table and poured his own coffee from Abel's pot without asking. He told Abel, in that smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once been told no, that the wolf was a sign. A rancher who went soft on predators went broke. A rancher who brought predators into his own barn was not a rancher at all. He said he was doing Abel a kindness and offering to take the burden off his hands. He said the deed would clear within a month. He said the check would be in the bank on the same day. Abel sat across from him and listened. He did not interrupt. He made Beck drink the coffee all the way to the dregs. Then he said the only sentence he had been saving for 9 years. I will die on this land, Harlan. So will my animals. Beck's smile did not change. It was not the kind of smile that changes. He stood and nodded to his riders and rode away. On the porch, he said something to one of his men that Abel could not hear, but which he felt in the air the way cattle feel a storm coming over the ridge. The mule Reuben stamped once in his stall, the way he always did when he smelled bad men. That night the wind began to rise. By morning it was a true blizzard, the kind that buries a yearling in 20 minutes and turns a pasture into a field of white blindness. Abel went out at first light to count the herd and found 31 head already drifting in the wrong direction, away from the creek and down toward the open range where the wind could work them to death in a single afternoon. He whistled for Reuben. The mule had sense enough to dig in, but the cattle had none. He had to turn them himself. He had made it about halfway back when he saw the wolf. It was standing at the edge of the pasture, hackles up, snow gathering on its torn ear, the leg healed enough to carry weight again. Abel had let it out 2 days earlier. He had expected it to leave. Wolves, in his experience, left when they mended. This one had not left. It had been hunting the rabbit hill on the eastern fence line. It had been avoiding the cattle. It had been, in the only words Abel could find for the thing he was seeing, working with him. The wolf turned north and began to move along the fence line with a slow, deliberate pace. Abel watched, disbelieving. The lead cow, an old white face he had bought as a yearling from his brother's first drive, lifted her head and turned. The rest followed. The wolf moved, the herd moved, and within an hour every head of cattle was walking north toward the sheltered draw on the back of Abel's property, a place Abel had not used since the grass failed there in the great drought. The grass had come back. The draw was deep enough to break the wind. The cattle settled in and lowered their heads against the storm. Abel sat on Reuben and watched the wolf walk the perimeter, marking the snow with a line of tracks that any other predator would smell and turn from. He understood in that moment what had been living in his barn for 6 weeks. It was not a pet. It was not a mercy. It was a bargain. He had saved it. It had stayed to save what was his. What Beck had not accounted for, in all his years of patience and his careful cruelty, was what a winter night on the open range does when you have not prepared for it. His riders were out that same night, with wire cutters, opening the gates between Abel's north pasture and the open range where the storm would scatter the cattle into a panic and into the road. They counted on the blizzard. They counted on the dark. They had done it twice before, in winters past, and each time Abel had lost a third of his herd and Beck's men had bought the strays for pennies at the railhead the following spring. The wolf heard them before Abel did. It began to run, not toward the riders, but along the fence line first, marking, then toward the barn where the 20 weakest of the cattle had been brought in for shelter against the worst night. Abel heard the chopping of hooves in the snow and the sharp, ugly sound of wire being cut. He unslung his rifle and walked toward the sound. He saw 3 riders working at the north gate. He saw the wire peel back. He saw the open range beyond, the white nothing where a panicked cow could run until she dropped. He raised the rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the The way a man fires who is not trying to kill a person, but is trying to make one understand a thing. The riders turned. The biggest one laughed, the kind of laugh that says a man like you cannot do a thing to a man like me. Then the wolf came over the rise. It hit the biggest rider at the shoulder and took him down into the snow before he could bring his own horse around. It did not kill him. It held him. The other two riders saw what was happening and turned their horses north. Abel fired the rifle into the air a second time, and a third, and a third. He did not shoot at any man. He shot the way he had shot the wolf in the snow 6 weeks earlier, the way a man shoots when he wants to make clear what he will and will not do. The riders did not come back that winter. They did not come back the next winter, either. There are some things a hired man will not ride through twice, and a wolf that means it is one of them. Abel carried the wolf back to the barn on his own shoulder. It had been cut on the barbed wire along the north fence. Abel stitched the cuts with a needle and sinew thread by the light of the lantern, the way his mother had taught him to stitch the torn ear of a dog that had been in a fight. The wolf lay still. The lantern flamed through 2 shadows on the wall, one of a man and one of a wolf, and they were both the same height, and both of them were watching the same door. If this story moved something in you, you're exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. When the blizzard broke on the morning of the 3rd day, Abel walked outside. The herd was where the wolf had put it, every head, the old white face at the center of them all. The snow had stopped at the fence line where the wolf had walked, the way a fire stops at a river. The wolf walked out to meet him. It sat down in his tracks. It did not look away. Abel put his hand on the wolf's head. The skull was warm under the fur. He stood there a long time, longer than he had ever stood any place in his life. He thought of Mary. He thought of Cora. He thought of his brother in the silver country, and of his father, and of the long line of men who had stood on this same piece of ground and made promises to it. He thought of the things he had given up on, the things he had stopped believing could come back to a man. He had stopped believing in luck. He had stopped believing in the kindness of animals. He had stopped believing that the truth of a man was ever seen by anyone but the man himself. The wolf leaned its weight against his leg, the way a tired horse leans against a hitching post when the wind has been bad. Abel did not move. He let the warmth go up his thigh and his side and his chest. He stood there long enough for the frost to come off his whiskers. The sheriff came up the road 3 days after the storm. He was a man named Bowden, slow on horseback, careful with his words, the kind of sheriff who did not move against Beck unless the law was already written. He did not have to write very much. The cut wire was still on the north fence, frozen now into the post. There was a wolf track running the full length of the cut, and there was a rider's blood on the snow that had not melted yet. Beck's hired man had admitted the whole thing from a hospital bed in town, where the doctor had given him 15 stitches and enough laudanum to keep him honest. Beck came to Abel's kitchen a week later. He had not abandoned the land deal. He would never abandon the land deal. What he had abandoned was the idea that the land would come to him through patience. He sat at the same table and poured his own coffee and explained to Abel what was about to happen. He was going to file against Abel in the territorial court for damages to a hired man by a dangerous animal. He was going to have the wolf put down as a public nuisance. He was going to have the north fence declared a public hazard and the back pasture condemned. He was going to take the water rights by eminent domain in the spring because the railroad was going to need them for the new station at Sulphur Creek. He laid each move on the table like a hand of cards, in order, and waited for Abel to fold. Abel did not fold. He did not speak, either. He poured Beck's coffee and set the cup down so the handle faced Beck exactly. Then he went out to the porch and whistled. The wolf came up from the lower pasture in a long, unhurried trot. There were 3 more behind it. He had not known there were 3 more. He had only ever seen one, the one with the torn ear. The others had come over the winter, the way wolves come when one of their own is settled. They sat down in the yard in a clean half-circle, facing the kitchen door. The biggest was the wolf Abel had nursed back from the snare. The smallest was barely bigger than the mule's head. They were all of them watching the same door. Beck came out onto the porch. He looked at the wolves. He looked at Abel. He understood, in the way that powerful men occasionally understand, that the situation he had built for 9 years had been quietly turned around inside a single winter by a man who had refused to kill an animal when every reason in the world said he should. He got on his horse. He did not say goodbye. He did not say anything at all. He rode down the road toward Sulphur Creek and did not look back. The territorial court ruled in Abel's favor in April. The hired man had confessed. Beck's wire was on Abel's fence. The wolf was not a public nuisance. The wolf had prevented one. The decree stripped Beck of the water rights he had bought, fined him a sum large enough to make him think twice about the next thing he considered, and required him to repair the north fence at his own cost before the spring thaw. There were other items in the decree, careful, slow, written in the language of a territory that did not yet have a state, but each of them removed one piece of the patience Beck had built over a decade. The bank in town changed hands that same summer. Beck sold his southern ranch first, then the middle one, and kept only the home place, which was no longer large enough to be impressive to anyone. Cora came home from Denver in the year after. She had read about the case in the Denver paper, of all places, carried down the wire, and printed in a column that did not usually have the Sulphur Creek Valley in it. She stood on the porch and looked at the herd, and then at her father, and then at the four wolves arranged in their patient half-circle beneath the cottonwood. She said the only thing she had come to say, which was that she had married a man who had no courage and no land and no animals, and that she had spent the 2 years since her mother's death being polite about it, and that she was done being polite. Abel did not answer. There was nothing to add. He set the kettle on. The wolves lay down in the yard and did not move. The cattle lowed in the back pasture. Reuben brayed once, the way he always did when he believed he was being ignored. The whole place smelled of pine smoke and cold water and the first green of spring. The wolves never left. They ran the fence line every night. They cleared the coyotes from the lower pasture by the end of the first summer. They did not touch a single one of Abel's calves. The valley learned, slowly, the way valleys learn, that the wolves were not a danger to anyone who had not first tried to be a danger to the man who fed them. Mr. Garvey started hanging a sign in his store window that read wolf-friendly goods in letters that had not been there before. Mrs. Jensen, in a quiet arrangement not discussed in church, began bringing Abel a peach pie every Sunday. The Jensen's boy, the one who had asked his father why Mr. Trenholm would not shoot the wolf, was the first of the valley's children to learn the names Abel had given the four of them: Torn Ear, Slate, Briar, and Quiet. In the long autumn of the year after the decree, in the hour before sunrise when the light comes up the way a hand is laid gently on a shoulder, Abel Trenholm walked out to the back fence. The herd was at the creek. The wolves were arrayed in their half-circle by the cottonwood. Cora was on the porch, braiding her daughter's hair at the stove. The mule was eating something he had no business eating. Abel stood for a long time at the fence line, one hand on the top wire, watching the rise of the sun. The wolf with the torn ear came up and stood beside him, shoulder against the fence post, close enough that the man and the animal breathed the same air. He had been given every reason in the world not to trust anything that breathed. He had been given every reason not to set a single thing down, not to let a single creature in, not to keep faith with anything that could not stand up and sign a contract and tell him in words what it meant to do. He had been given 9 years of patience from a man who intended to take his land. He had been given 6 weeks of trouble from a valley that thought he had gone soft in the head. He had walked out and put his hand on an animal that would have cost him 100 rifles to replace, and he had let the animal show him what it knew. And what it knew was that the man had earned the right to keep the place where he had been put. The first light struck the meadow. The wolves lifted their heads together, all 4 of them, and turned toward the sun as if they had been waiting for it the way a man waits for a letter he knows is coming. The cattle rose from the creek and walked single file toward the back pasture, the old white face leading as she had always led. Abel watched them go. The wolf leaned into his leg. The wire sang softly under his hand, the way wire sings when the day is about to warm. That is the only form of forgiveness there is. Walking out, in the early morning, and finding that what you saved has saved you back. If you stayed with us tonight, leave us a single word in the comments. Just one, the one that fits how this story landed in you. Next time, we'll tell the story of a schoolteacher sent to a snowbound mining town nobody wanted, and the mute child who refused to learn from anyone but her. Until then, good night from Sulphur Creek. May the things you keep find their way back to you whole.